Let's continue our discussion of data warehousing fact tables and talk about the somewhat curiously named Factless fact table. Remember that we use fact tables in a data warehouse as a home for the facts, the measurements that we want to keep track of, and that means that a fact is not the same as a fact table. So far, we've looked at three other types of fact tables, each of which has a very specific purpose and a very specific usage, and we'll combine them depending upon the types of analytics we want to do as the best means to store the data for relatively easy and relatively uncomplicated data access. In the case of the Factless fact table, we actually have two different reasons and two different purposes for which we would use one of these. The first is we want to record the occurrence of some sort of a transaction, but there's actually nothing to measure about that transaction. And the second is that we want to make a formal record of some sort of a coverage or eligibility relationship. And let's look at examples of both of those. In the case of the first, with a Factless fact table we have an event that occurs that we want to track, but there's nothing significant to measure about that event. Let's say, for example, that students within our university can register for online webinars throughout the semester. What we would like to do is track which students register for which webinars, the date that each student registers for any given webinar, as well as the scheduled date that each webinar is supposed to be held. And here we have three very simple dimension tables set up for student, for webinars, and for date, each of which has a single column as its primary key. And in the middle, we have a fact table called the webinar registration fact. And you'll notice, like all the other fact tables we looked at, we have the foreign keys that combine to serve as the primary key, pointing back to the dimension tables that we've set up. Now, one thing to notice, though, is that just like in the accumulating snapshot fact table, we actually have two different relationships back from the fact table, in this case to the date dimension, because there's two different dates we want to keep track of. The date that a student actually registered for a webinar, as well as the date that that webinar is supposed to be held. And with that, there's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, you'll come across a lot of situations where you're going to have multiple relationships, typically back to the time dimension, but maybe to other dimensions as well. So there you see in that middle, the webinar registration fact, all of the different key fields, but there's nothing else. Now, so far, every other fact table we've looked at has some sort of a fact in it, some sort of a measurement. There's nothing here, and again, remember, the purpose of a Factless fact table is we want to make a record of something. There's just nothing to measure about that. So this, again, is our first type of Factless fact table. And what we would do is keep track of the very presence of the rows. That's actually the measurement of the occurrence of an event. The fact that there will be a row in a Factless fact table means that something actually happened, even though there's no salary to keep track of, or a student loan amount, or anything else like that. What we'll do then is count rows within the Factless fact table, either with or without filters. And basically, the Factless fact table is set up as the primary foreign key columns only. Notice the asterisk. There's a little variation to the theme that I'll cover in a moment. So let's look at that schema again, and here's some of the questions we would want to ask from there. How many students registered for all of our webinars held last semester? Basically, it would be you'd filter on the date dimension, make sure that you keep track of only the webinars that were scheduled within last semester, and then just count the number of rows in the Factless fact table that meet that criteria. Or in this case, how many webinars has Julie Waterston registered for since becoming a student? We would just then filter by Julie Waterston over in the student dimension and get the number of rows in that Factless fact table, and that would give us just the count that we're looking for. We also might want to find out how many students registered for each of our webinar offerings last year that were held that covers study tips for final exams, and presume we had a few of them. We would filter on that particular webinar and then look in the dates that covered last year and get the count of the number of students. If you want, you can also have multiple Factless fact tables in the same schema. So here's a good example where we have a webinar registration fact, the same one we just looked at, but also a webinar attendance fact. And both of them would be factless fact tables because, as you see here, they have the key fields only and there's no measurements, no facts in them. And this way we can keep track of the webinars as they were actually set up to be held, and then the ones that students actually attended. So you could keep track, for example, of students that might have signed up for a bunch of webinars but didn't actually attend them if you wanted to try to figure that out. You also, if you wanted to, you could combine factless and transaction-grain fact tables in the same schema. Here we have our webinar registration fact, but also a webinar attendance fact. Suppose we want to keep track of not just whether a student attended or not, which essentially is the count of the students, but we want to know how long each student actually attended a webinar for. Did they stay for the whole thing? Did they only log on for a minute or two just to get extra credit, and that was it? So you could have a regular transaction-grain fact table to keep track of attendance with the measurement, the fact of attendance duration, and then the webinar registration fact is our factless fact table to keep track of the registrations. Now, remember that asterisk from a couple slides ago. Sometimes with a factless fact table, you can use something called a tracking fact. And it's still a factless fact table, but essentially it's a way to have a sort of quasi-measurement or a quasi-fact in that fact table if for some reason you're just uncomfortable creating a fact table with nothing but keys. There's really no reason to do this, but some people will do this. So think of it as a tracking fact. The value of a tracking fact is always set to 1, and what that means is if you wanted to count the rows, which is how we keep track of the measurements in a factless fact table according to filters or without the filters, you could use the SQL sum function rather than the count function and then just sum up that value of the tracking fact as opposed to counting the number of rows. It is a little more readable and understandable. It might, however, be less efficient in execution. So using a tracking fact isn't always a great idea, but it's an option. Now, the second type of factless fact table allows us to record a particular relationship or association among multiple parties, even if no transactions actually occurred. Typically, you're going to have a starting or ending date of that particular relationship. It doesn't have to be. There are some examples where you could have just one date, but the classic example would typically have a starting and ending date. So basically, you'd have two relationships back to the time dimension. So here's a good example. What we would like to keep track of are the academic advisors who are assigned to students. So we have our student dimension that we've seen several times. We have our date dimension, and we also now have an advisor dimension. What we'd like to do is, for example, if a student actually visited an advisor, you could use our first type of factless fact table to record the occurrence. A student actually shows up, makes an appointment with an advisor. We know that there is a student-advisor relationship because we have a row in our first type of factless fact table. Let's just say we recorded the duration of the visit. You could actually use a regular transaction-grain fact table to keep track of that relationship. However, suppose a student never visited his or her advisor. We still want a record of that assignment, but suppose next semester the student gets a different advisor, we potentially could never know and never be able to analyze all the student advisor assignments if, for example, the student never visited his or her advisor. So that's where this type of a factless fact table comes in. What we have here, you'll notice, we have a key linkage between the advisor assignment factless fact table back to the student dimension, another one back to the advisor dimension, and as I mentioned earlier, two relationships, two linkages back to the date dimension for both the beginning and the ending dates of that particular assignment. But again, it's a factless fact table, so there's no dimensions there. And what we can do is answer questions along the lines of what students were assigned to advisor Stephen Jackson between August 15th, 2020 and May 31st, 2021.